Testing. Testing. Testing.
So, like I said, not going to be contentious. In the event that we have an extra amendment that's proposed during the markup, because we have all of the amendments. Yeah. It's not the case. Clear to sometimes it happens that one of the members will say, like, I have an amendment to HR da 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 that I want to propose now. And everyone's like, and everyone on the inside does that. But so when that happens, they have to compile it here. She and I have to look at it, and then we look at you guys and we say.
Testing.
And you guys will literally sprint, make 80 copies, come back, and we'll distribute all the others. Really? Before. So the chances of that happening is 0 to 0, but it might happen. So, yeah, if we look back, you guys will sit here and you want the whole thing. And in the event that we have to, just make sure that we get 80 copies, distribute them. And then what happens is after they read it, they can amend the amendment, say something else, and if that happens, 80 copies again come back, and then we'll get to the point where we vote. Most likely we'll vote over Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman says aye, the doors are locked, we're not letting anyone leave. So, it's not open. No matter how hard you try.
Testing.
So yeah, in the
Testing.
Rachel Lebanon, the minority staff, sits here. Jean sits here. I sit here. Ledge council sits here.
2 ledge councils here?
Yeah. Sometimes one.
The third?
Well, that's Doug. That's our Doug Anderson. Yeah. Doug Anderson sits here.
You're middle dog, huh?
Yeah.
Testing.
It's fun.
And then you do the
I do the time and I do the attendance.
What is there some other time?
It doesn't. Well, it is one. Markup's a little different with like attendance. Like we don't go in the order in which they like seniority. It's just whoever wants to speak.
Do they still get 5?
Yep, still get 5, and they can remark on any of the bills, especially the ones that they propose. That's all.
Cool. So what's your favorite markup?
Would have been the State Department authorization bill.
That was killed. Who killed it?
Mr. Smith on our side.
Why'd he kill it?
He won. Well, the Democrats also did too, but Mr. Smith wanted to propose something to the State Department authorization bill, which would have authorized the State Department for the first time in 15 years on fact. Anyway.
Testing.
Mr. Smith wanted to include something about working with that's not happening. Yeah. And then they were like, oh, if we're going to do this, we're going to put this in the bill. So I forget exactly what that was.
Mic 1 testing.
Mr. Smith said, oh, you're going to put this in. And then someone over here was like, well, I'm going to put this in it. And then the chairman was like, really, guys? So they cut it. Cancel this day up. He's like, I'm not harming this.
Testing. Mic 2 testing. Testing.
The committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up 10 bipartisan measures. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous materials on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intend to consider today's measures en bloc. And so without objection, the following items previously provided to the members, and also, by the way, it's in your packets here, will all be considered en bloc and are considered as read. And they are House Resolution 931 regarding the Ukrainian famine back from 1932, 1933. House Resolution 1006 condemning the deteriorating situation in Venezuela with the Cook Amendment 64 in the nature of substitute and the Series Amendment 22. House Resolution 1052 affirming United States-Australia space cooperation. House Resolution 1055 affirming strong United States-Liberia ties. H.R. 1567, United States-Mexico Economic Partnership Act with the Castro Amendment 104 in the nature of a substitute. H.R. 4591, preventing Iranian Destabilization of Iraq Act, with the Kinzinger Amendment 35 in the nature of a substitute and the Poe Amendment 114 and Wilson Amendment 70. H.R. 5273, this is the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act of 2018 with the Engel Amendment 115 in the nature of substitute. H.R. 6018, Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership Act of 2018 with the McCall Amendment 109 in the nature of a substitute and the Meadows Amendment 165. H.R. 6413, the Stop Organ Trafficking Act with the Royce Amendment 143. And H.R. 6651, this is the Pepfar Extension Act of 2018 with the Smith Amendment 113. So I now recognize myself to speak on today's business. So first, we have the Pepfar Extension Act, and for many of you who were on this committee or know the history of the committee, in 2003, Congress and the Bush administration united in an effort to stem the tide of HIV infections that threatened to wipe out a generation of people living in Africa. And today, PEPFAR has proven highly effective. It has saved innumerable lives. It has won the U.S. a great deal of goodwill. Our committee has held many hearings, briefings, gone to Africa on multiple occasions to conduct oversight over the supply chain for this life-saving program. And we will be finalizing a report on this important work. And I want to thank Chairman Smith and Ranking Members Engel and Bass for their dedication to this issue. Next, we have the Preventing Destabilization of Iraq Act. And this codifies and enhances existing authorities for the President to hold Iran and to hold Iran's militias accountable for their deadly activities in Iraq. These militias are not only a threat to the Iraqi people, because earlier this month, these militias launched mortars at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, if you'll remember. I want to thank the author, Representative Kinzinger, and Chairman Poe, who has held hearings on this issue on his subcommittee. Next, I'd like to thank Ranking Member Engel and Chairman McCall for the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act. And this act will allow the U.S. to better coordinate efforts to reduce conflict overseas, which has caused unprecedented levels of human displacement. The bill requires strong monitoring and evaluation so our overseas missions can learn from their past successes and learn from their failures. And I'd also like to thank Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Keating for their work on the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership Act, because Boko Haram and ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliates continue to wreak havoc across West Africa. So this legislation will improve U.S. diplomatic development and defense programs to confront these threats. Next, we have the Stop Organ Trafficking Act. Global scarcity for transplant organs has led to an annual global black market of $1.2 billion. Authoritarian states and human traffickers and even ISIS terrorists have profited from this disgusting practice. This bill closes a gap in U.S. law that currently fails to recognize organ trafficking as a form of human trafficking. Next, we have the U.S.-Mexico Economic Partnership Act. As our neighbor to the south, Mexico is an important trading partner of the United States, so this bill builds on existing programs to increase our educational and professional exchanges between our two countries. Next, I'd like to thank Chairman Cook for his timely and important resolution on Venezuela. This resolution further affirms Congress's continuing commitment to helping the people of Venezuela in their struggle against the Maduro regime's brutal and destructive rule. And I also thank Representative Donovan for his resolution that affirms the strong U.S.-Liberia relationship and our commitment to helping the Liberian people promote peace, prosperity, and democracy through the ongoing reconciliation process. This is an issue that I have long been engaged on, dating back to the committee's role in pressing for the arrest of the notorious war criminal Charles Taylor and then for his successful prosecution. Next, we have House Resolution 931. This resolution recognizes the anniversary of the brutal and manufactured famine in Ukraine in the 1930s, and it expresses Congress's unwavering support for the Ukrainian people in their continuing struggle to establish a peaceful, democratic, and secure country in which basic human rights are respected. And finally, I thank Representative Castro for his resolution, which affirms the value of our long-standing alliance with Australia and our mutually beneficial cooperation in a broad range of areas from defense to space. And I now recognize the ranking member, Elliot Engel of New York, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this markup, and thanks to all our colleagues for their hard work. There are 10 good measures before us today, and I'm pleased to support them all. First, I'd like to discuss H.R. 5273, the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act, which I authored with Representatives Poe, McCall, Keating, and others. Thank you all, and thanks, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this up today. Global levels of violence are at a 25-year peak, and when a region faces violence, the effects are felt far and wide. Economic development backslides, global stability wavers, terrorists thrive, and people flee their homes, creating large-scale refugee and migrant crises. So it's critical that we work to prevent this violence from happening in the first place. Since September 11th, we've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't when it comes to stabilizing conflicts and preventing violence from breaking out. Those lessons should shape American policy. And that's what this bill does. It establishes an initiative to reduce fragility and violence that will align American engagement with the lessons we've learned. It will require the State Department, USAID, and the Department of Defense to coordinate their diplomatic development and security activities with a focus on 10 priority countries. And it requires best practices as we work with partners, measure results, and adapt to changing conditions. We need to update our government's policies to prevent violence, and I ask all members to join me in supporting the bill. And when unspeakable violence does occur, we need to properly recognize the perpetrators of those crimes and hold them accountable. Mr. Donovan's measure, H.Res. 1055, would help do so by reaffirming the historic U.S. relationship with Liberia and calling for the government of Liberia to hold accountable those who carried out mass violence and atrocities during the country's civil war in the 1990s. In places where instability leads to terrorism and conflict, it's important that we collaborate with our allies in a united interagency effort. So I support Mr. McCall's Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership Act, which strengthens our work across the U.S. government to assist partners in the Sahel and Maghreb regions of Africa to counter terrorism and violent extremism. Our partnerships with foreign countries are important for economic development as well, especially when it comes to our neighbors. And that brings me to Mr. Cuellar's United States-Mexico Economic Partnership Act. Mexico is a friend and ally, our third largest trading partner, and a country which we share extraordinarily close cultural and familial ties. This bill requires the Secretary of State to expand educational and professional exchange programs with Mexico. It's important that we send a strong message to the Mexican people that the United States Congress will not walk away from them, despite the damage that has been done to this relationship in recent months and years. I'll turn now to a resolution condemning the dire humanitarian situation in Venezuela, sponsored by Representatives Cook and Cires. The current situation in Venezuela is really just horrendous. President Maduro has turned the country into a full-fledged dictatorship and victimized his citizens. It's a tragedy which requires world leaders to speak out, but not with the sort of reckless threats and bellicose rhetoric we've heard from the administration. This measure represents a strong bipartisan message from Congress, and I urge all members to support it. Keeping countries stable is critical, especially in areas where foreign governments are seeking to create disorder. Mr. Kinzinger and Mr. Swazi's Preventing Destabilization of Iraq Act works to prevent dangerous outsiders from nefariously interfering in Iraq by slapping sanctions on any foreign person conducting significant destabilizing activities in that country. Especially at this time in Iraq, it's important that the United States send a clear signal to the Iraqi people and regional actors that what happens in Iraq matters to the United States, that we have an interest, and I thank my colleagues for this bill. Next, I'll discuss the Pepfar Extension Act. As the sponsor of the last Pepfar reauthorization in 2013, I'm proud to support the bipartisan bill before us today. Pepfar, as the chairman mentioned, is a landmark program dedicated to combating the spread of HIV/AIDS. Thanks to Pepfar, 14 million men, women, and children are on life-saving treatment, and more than 2 million babies were born HIV-free to mothers living with HIV. This is remarkable progress, and we must keep striving for more. The Pepfar Extension Act before us today will help ensure this phenomenal work continues for another 5 years. It's an excellent program with bipartisan support, and I urge all members to join me in voting for this measure. I'd also like to recognize Mr. Castro's resolution affirming U.S.-Australia cooperation on space research and exploration. I support this measure that highlights the important area of international cooperation with one of America's closest friends and allies. Next, Congressman Sandy Levin's measure that recognizes the 85th anniversary of the 1932 famine in Ukraine. As we watch the Russian occupation in Crimea and aggression against eastern Ukraine, we're reminded that this horrific human tragedy was designed by Stalin to crack down on Ukrainian resistance to Soviet rule. With this measure, Congress solemnly remembers the millions of Ukrainians who perished in this genocide. I urge all members to support it. Another good bill before us today is the Stop Organ Trafficking Act. I want to thank Representative Deutsch and Trott for reintroducing this measure, which passed with overwhelming support in the last Congress. The need for transplant organs throughout the world has led to a gruesome underground trade of organs. It's horrifying, and we need to have laws and research directed at solving this. This bill is a step in the right direction. I urge all members to support the measure. Once again, thank you to all our members. Thank you for your hard work on this committee over the last 2 years. I want to just say at the end of this markup, we will have a brief meeting here in the room, in the chairman's room, with the Prime Minister of Kosovo, and I hope that all members of the committee on both sides will join us for a few minutes to meet with Ramush Haradnai, the Prime Minister of Kosovo. So thank you for everything, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Paul Cook of California seeks recognition.
Chairman Rice, thank you for holding this important markup today. I am pleased to be joined by Ranking Member Engel, Chairman Emeritus Ross Layton, and Subcommittee Ranking Member Sears, along with several other members in sponsoring House Resolution 1006 on Venezuela. The situation in Venezuela worsens every day, with hyperinflation projected to reach an unimaginable 1,000,000% by the end of the year. China and Russia continue bankrolling Venezuela's failed economy, and Cuban intelligence agents have enabled Nicolas Maduro to suppress the opposition and illegitimately cling to power. More than 2.3 million Venezuelans have fled the country, creating a vast regional migration and potential public health crisis as countries have struggled to respond. This week, President Trump, Vice President Pence affirmed U.S. commitment to supporting the Venezuelan people. The announcement of an additional $48 million for humanitarian assistance brings total American support to over $118 million in aid to Western Hemisphere countries responding to the Venezuelan migration crisis. The additional U.S. sanctions on 4 members of Nicolas Maduro's inner circle and seizure of $20 million of private jets are just critical to show the criminality and corruption of the Maduro regime at the expense of the Venezuelan people, and emphasize that loyalty to Maduro comes at a steep cost. These efforts build on previous U.S. sanctions, as well as those by Canada, the European Union, and Switzerland. Moving forward, we need to see more actions by the U.S. and countries in the Western Hemisphere. House Resolution 1006 that we are discussing today recognizes and applauds the efforts by the Lima Group, the Organization of American States, as well as the 19 countries that voted in favor of the most recent OAS resolution on Venezuela last June. Notably, there are another 12 countries in Latin America and Caribbean who voted against or abstained from voting on that OAS resolution. Today, there is no excuse for enabling the continuation of tyranny in Venezuela or the corresponding havoc on the region. This resolution affirms the U.S. support for the legitimate National Assembly and Supreme Court and urges countries in the region, especially those 12 who have been reticent to take action, to support democracy in Venezuela and an investigation under international law into crimes against humanity by the Maduro regime. Recent leadership by the governments of Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Paraguay, and Canada to seek to hold Maduro accountable for his crimes against the Venezuelan people is welcome news, and I commend these governments' actions. In conclusion, the resolution also urges further U.S. sanctions and public diplomacy efforts to expose corruption among Venezuelan officials and greater regional and global coordination on imposing sanctions on Venezuelan officials responsible for the ongoing crisis, and it demonstrates the continuing and unswavering support of the U.S. Congress for the people of Venezuela in all efforts to end this crisis and support a return to democracy. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Mr. Joaquin Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all the members and everybody who worked on the pieces of legislation in front of us today. The bills and resolutions considered today on Australia, Ukraine, Venezuela, Liberia, Mexico, Iran, global fragility, counterterrorism in West Africa, organ trafficking, and HIV/AIDS address important issues in the world. And I'd first like to thank the committee for considering my resolution that I authored with Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York on supporting greater cooperation on space research, exploration, and utilization with our Australian allies. This July, the Australian government set up their first space program. This year marks 100 years of close cooperation between the United States and Australia, dating back to the First World War, where the two countries fought side by side. The alliance has only deepened in the century that followed to include diplomatic, cultural, and economic cooperation, in addition to space exploration. In fact, Australia played a part in one of America's most notable achievements in space. The first images of Neil Armstrong on the moon were relayed to the American people and the world through radio stations in Australia. There is value in the United States deepening cooperation with our allies and partners in exploring space and finding commercial opportunities outside our planet as we seek to improve our understanding of the universe and our place within it. And I appreciate the support of my colleagues in this measure and would ask for their support on it. I would next like to voice my support for the United States-Mexico Economic Partnership Act introduced by Ranking Member Engel and by my colleague from Texas, Henry Cuellar. At a time when we have a president that's consistently attacked Mexico and Hispanic Americans in our own nation, this bill supports greater educational and economic ties between the United States and Mexico when we need it most. A friendly, productive relationship with our neighbor to the south is vital for the continued prosperity and security of Americans, especially those in communities from border states like mine, Texas. The programs the bill supports through the 100,000 Strong in the Americas initiative will help communities on both sides of the border strengthen academic opportunities, commerce, energy infrastructure, and medical care. And I'd like to thank the committee for marking this important measure up. Next, I'd like to thank Chairman Cook and Ranking Member Cetas for introducing the resolution on Venezuela that we're considering today. The situation in the country is dire, with the failed policies of Nicolas Maduro resulting in an economic collapse and the flight of millions of Venezuelan citizens to neighboring countries. I urge my colleagues in this committee to support this measure and to support efforts by the Organization of American States and our partners in the region to support democracy and fight for democracy in Venezuela. I also would like to thank the countries in the region, particularly Colombia, that have taken in so many of those that are fleeing the dire circumstances and situation in Venezuela. All countries, including the United States, have a moral obligation to help those who flee persecution and catastrophe and are in desperation. And I'm disappointed that the administration has reduced the number of refugees our country will be taking in this coming year, down to 30,000 from an already low 45,000. We're closing our doors and putting up walls at a time when there are many more people displaced around the world from their homes. In fact, today there are about 70 million people around the world who are displaced. I'm proud to support the other measures as well. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Dan Donovan of New York.
Thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for holding this markup today. We have many important measures on the calendar, and as always, it's a pleasure to work in a bipartisan manner to tackle tough foreign affairs matters and push towards legislation that will make a difference in the world. Our schedule this week, both for hearings and this markup, has a heavy emphasis on global human rights. Of all the soaring rhetoric on this topic, our founding fathers said it best in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As this committee has seen time and time again, chaos lies in the wake of human rights violations. And when that happens, it causes a country and even an entire region and continent to become destabilized. This then creates a downward spiral of violence. Murder, rape, torture, and the lack of human dignity makes an area ripe for radicalization and leads to the absence of even the most basic sanitary and health services. This dangerous combination then threatens our security here in the United States. Protecting human rights across the globe is not just morally the right thing to do, but it is also vital to our own national security. Stopping war crimes before they happen is just as important as ensuring that justice prevails afterwards. Without justice, there cannot be healing for the victims, and the cycle of turbulence will start anew. This is why I'm proud to sponsor H.R. 1055 to affirm strong United States-Liberian ties and support for democratic principles and call for full implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, including the establishment of an extraordinary criminal tribunal for Liberia. My district, Staten Island and South Brooklyn, is home to thousands of Liberians who have fled the turbulence of civil war. My constituents have directly told me how important it is to them that Liberia establish an extraordinary war crimes tribunal. Liberia itself recommended the establishment of a war crimes tribunal in its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Liberia's current president, President George Weah, called for the establishment of a war crimes tribunal in 2004 as a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. It is time to put this into action. At this very moment, people who have committed unspeakable war crimes hold positions in Liberia's government. For example, Senator Prince Y. Johnson is an infamous warlord who tortured and murdered former President Samuel Doe. There is a video of Johnson's sickening mutilation of President Doe, where Johnson is despicably sipping on a beer fanned by an assistant while Johnson's minions cut off Doe's ear. With the presence of Johnson and others in the current government, we are seeing Liberia's slow creep backward towards the murderous mayhem of its Civil War days. Liberians are rightfully clamoring for justice. Without it, I fear there will be further violence and turbulence which nobody wants to see. This is why it is so crucial to call upon Liberia and President Wade to establish a war crimes tribunal. Thank you, Chairman Royce, my Democratic co-leader, Congressman Hank Johnson, and all of our other co-sponsors for supporting this resolution. I would also like to thank the staff committee, especially Meg, Sean, and Marie, for their work on this matter. I urge all my colleagues to support this resolution and continue to seek justice across the globe. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remaining of my time back.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Mr. Albio Series of New Jersey.
I want to start by thanking Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for bringing up these measures today. The 10 bipartisan measures being considered today is a testament to the continued efforts of Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel to set aside partisanship and ensure this committee gets things done. I'd like to speak in support of House Resolution 1006, an important resolution introduced by Chairman Paul Cook. This resolution highlights the deteriorating situation in Venezuela and the regional humanitarian crisis it has caused. It also reaffirms support for the legitimate National Assembly and urges further regional action to help the Venezuelan people. The resolution supports the findings of the Organization of American States panel of experts that states that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the government of Nicolás Maduro has committed crimes against humanity and urges the region to support an investigation under international law. I would also like to thank the chairman and his staff for working with us on an amendment to highlight Maduro's continued crackdown on political expression. Deputy Juan Requesnas was detained last month as Maduro used an alleged assassination attempt in August as an opportunity to further crack down on his opposition. He is just one of many who have been detained and disappeared as Maduro tries to further consolidate power. I want to thank Chairman Royce, Chairman Cook, and Ranking Member Engel for their continued attention to the plight of the Venezuelan people. I support the resolution and urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Ileana Ross-Lehtinen of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I add my support for all the measures before us today. I'd like to offer some brief remarks on just a few. First, I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor along with you, Mr. Chairman, as well as our ranking member, Mr. Engel, Karen Bass, my fellow co-chair of the HIV/AIDS Caucus, Barbara Lee, of Chris Smith's Pepfar Extension Act. This important bill would extend this longstanding bipartisan life-saving program for another 5 years. In 2003, President George W. Bush called on Congress to take action in responding to the global crisis of HIV/AIDS, and I am proud that not only did we answer the president's call, but this committee took a leading role in the response. I will never forget standing in the Oval Office as President Bush signed this essential program into law. When Pepfar began 15 years ago, only 50,000 people in Africa were receiving HIV treatment. Today, there are over 14 million people receiving HIV treatment globally, and over 2 million babies are born HIV-free to HIV-positive women. Amazing. Pepfar is truly a shining example of American leadership and what our country can achieve when our branches of government work together in a bipartisan manner. The United States must continue to lead the global response to HIV/AIDS, build on the strong partnerships that we have built around the world. It continues to be the largest and most successful humanitarian aid commitment made by any nation in history. I urge all of my colleagues to give it their full support. We see some of the proud advocates here today in the audience. Next, I'm also proud to be an original co-sponsor of our Western Hemisphere Subcommittee Chairman Paul Cook's House Resolution 10006. This important resolution condemns the Maduro regime for its role in the deterioration of Venezuela's democratic institutions and for the creation of a humanitarian crisis that grows worse by the day. Maduro's failed policies have left Venezuelan people malnourished, sick, poor, without food, without basic medical supplies. The United States and our partners have a responsibility to do everything that we can to ensure humanitarian aid reaches the people of Venezuela, and I'm glad that this resolution calls not just for more assistance, but for greater coordination in the region and beyond. I commend the administration for allocating funds to help Venezuelan refugees in Colombia and for its continued targeted sanctions against the regime, including those this very week against Maduro's inner circle. Whether it's people like Cilia Flores, Maduro's wife, or Diosdado Cabello, the head of the sham Constituent Assembly, we must continue putting pressure on those responsible and sending a strong message that the U.S. will not sit idly by as the regime continues its repression. We must also, as this bill does, express our unwavering support for Venezuela's legitimate democratic institutions, like its duly elected National Assembly and the Supreme Court, as well as civil society. I thank my colleague Paul Cook and Albiocires for their leadership on this resolution and for their tireless support for the people of Venezuela. I offer my support also for my friend Adam Kinzinger's bill, the Preventing Iran Destabilization Act. This important bill would impose sanctions against a multitude of Iranian militias, proxies, terrorist groups, and other nefarious entities operating in Iraq who are undermining our efforts at stabilization. As Mr. Kinzinger knows firsthand, Iran's activities in Iraq only benefit one country, Iran. And finally, I'd like to say just a few words of support of Mr. McCall's bill, H.R. 6018, the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership Act, launched in 2005. This is an important program for building partner country capacity in a critical region of the world. This bill both codifies the partnership into law while helping to sharpen its focus with some necessary oversight. I offer my full support for this as well as all of your bills. As always, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. We go now to Mr. David Cicilline from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and to the ranking member of this committee for bringing forth these important bills and resolutions. While the world is facing the largest refugee crisis in recorded history, with 22.5 million refugees worldwide, the Trump administration has cut refugee admissions for 2019 to a record low of 30,000. In our own hemisphere, conditions in Venezuela have led to the largest migration crisis of its kind in recent Latin American history. According to the United Nations, more than 2.3 million Venezuelans have left their country since 2014. It's important for the United States to stand with partners in our hemisphere to condemn the actions of the Maduro regime, expose corruption among Venezuelan officials, support democratic actors, and provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Venezuela. I'm proud to support HRES 1006 and to be a co-sponsor of this resolution, which condemns the deteriorating situation in Venezuela and the regional humanitarian crisis it has caused, and calls on the President to increase support to the Venezuelan people. HRES 1055, which affirms strong United States-Liberia ties and support for democratic principles and calls for full implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, including the establishment of an extraordinary criminal tribunal for Liberia, affirms the U.S. commitment to helping the Liberian people promote peace, prosperity, and democracy through the reconciliation process and supports the efforts of the State Department and USAID in advancing the rule of law, effective governance, and strong civil society in Liberia. In March of this year, the United Nations mission in Liberia successfully completed its mandate to help stabilize and develop Liberia following its civil wars. I traveled to Liberia in 2013 and saw firsthand the amazing progress achieved by the people of Liberia in cooperation with the United States, the UN, and the international community. Under the 2003 Comprehensive Peace Agreement, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to address the widespread atrocities that had been committed. However, Liberia has yet to hold a single person to account for past abuses. The United States and Liberia share close historical, political, and economic ties, and it's right that we should raise our voices alongside the international community to call upon the Liberian government to establish a process of accountability to ensure that the perpetrators of gross human rights violations and war crimes are brought to justice. I'm proud to support and co-sponsor this measure and encourage my colleagues to do the same. I'm also proud to support H.R. 1567, the United States-Mexico Economic Partnership Act. The United States and Mexico also share a long history of friendship and partnership. The past and futures of both our nations are intertwined. Today, at a time when divisive rhetoric is easier to come by than a kind word, it's more important than ever to strengthen the ties of friendship and cooperation with our neighbors to the south. By increasing educational and professional exchanges between our countries, the United States-Mexico Economic Partnership will help citizens of both nations to build relationships, share knowledge, and create opportunities that will help both countries grow and prosper. H.R. 6413, the strategy to oppose predatory organ trafficking, is an important step forward in addressing a horrific practice and protecting the most vulnerable. Human trafficking for organ removal is at once an egregious human rights abuse and a form of human trafficking. Motivated by demand, international criminal organizations have taken the shortage of organs as an easy opportunity to pressure people from countries living in poverty into selling their organs. By recognizing organ trafficking in the U.S. human trafficking framework and requiring reporting on trafficking of persons for the removal of their organs, this bill shines a light on this nightmarish practice. And finally, H.R. 6651, Pepfar Extension Act of 2008. I've always been a proud and vocal proponent of Pepfar, and I'm glad that it has earned bipartisan support from Congress and multiple administrations. This program has enabled expanded access to antiviral therapies for those suffering with HIV and AIDS, which has led to a decrease in deaths from this devastating disease all around the world. It supports more than 14 million people with life-saving antiviral treatment and has contributed to the well-being of more than 2.2 million babies born HIV-free to pregnant women living with HIV. It's critical that the United States continue to play a leadership role in the fight against this disease, and that's why I am once again proud to support and co-sponsor the extension of Pepfar in H.R. 6651, the Pepfar Extension Act of 2008. I'm proud to support all these measures and urge my colleagues to do the same and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Tom Garrett of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the members and the committee for bringing forth these meaningful pieces of legislation. I'm going to isolate my comments specifically on HRES 1006 and Venezuela and take this opportunity to speak to the tragic pattern that we've demonstrated across over 100 years of the failure to learn the lessons taught to us very clearly by history. Mr. Chairman, this legislation is frustrating only insofar as I wish we could do more. A sense of Congress regarding a tragedy that's literally impacted millions is the right thing to do, and I am glad to support it and add my name to it. And yet, time and again, we've watched as individuals have been swept to power, Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolas Maduro, under promises to create utopian paradises by virtue of government regulation. When this government regulation occurs at the expense of free markets, when it occurs vis-a-vis the disincentivization of individual initiative, these promises of fairness manifest themselves in a uniform distribution of poverty and suffering. Whether Cambodia or Maoist China, whether the former Soviet Union or Cuba, the patterns and outcomes are all the same. And it is many times that I have implored my peers and superiors on this committee to remember the words of Arthur Vandenberg that politics should stop at the water's edge. So I will leave out American political leaders and their comments on Venezuela over the last going into 20 years. But let me say, when luminaries and thought leaders like Michael Moore and Sean Penn join hands with people like Hugo Chavez, when the leader of the British Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, suggests that Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro will work to advance the cause of people struggling across Venezuela, what we have seen throughout the course of history is literally the destruction of lives. Blessed with vast mineral resources, Venezuela not long ago was the wealthiest, most prosperous country in Central and Latin America. We now see literally millions displaced in a population wherein the average weight loss over the last 365 days is closing on 20 pounds. Maybe I should move there. Having said that and making light, it's a tragedy that need not repeat itself. Mr. Chairman, before I came to this body and after I leave it, I will consider myself a historian, and some lessons are writ large on the pages of history if we're only willing to listen. No less a thought luminary than Gandhi once stated that man cannot be made good by law. And while I seek the best for the collective, I believe to my very core that the best for the collective is achieved by empowering the individual. Therefore, Mr. Chairman, it's with some satisfaction that I lend my support to HRES 1006, but some disappointment that we seem condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past. Thank you for your time, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. We appreciate your observations, Mr. Garrett. I would say the advantage of the sense of Congress on sanctions and us moving this measure and the discussions we've had in subcommittee and full committee on it have had a desired effect in terms of pressuring the administration. And 2 days ago, they did announce sanctions on Venezuela. But I think your point is well taken, and but I did want to make the point that our actions here and our pressures here often have results. We go now to Tom Suozzi of New York.
Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, thank you again for your continued bipartisan work on this committee. The measures put forward here today are another example of the great work this committee has done under your bipartisan leadership. Iran is continuing to use corruption and violence and their malign influence to manipulate Iraq's political system. It's threatening Iraq's peace and stability and undermining their economic reconstruction. I'd like to speak today in support of H.R. 4591, which I am co-sponsoring, the Preventing Destabilization of Iraq Act. And I want to thank Representative Kinzinger for his leadership on promoting stability throughout the Middle East. At the United Nations this week, Iranian President Rouhani spoke against foreign interventions and imposition of, quote, alien wishes of the people of the region, close quote. In an Atlantic op-ed last year, his foreign minister, Zarif, complained about countries which support, quote, non-state actors who wreak havoc through terror, close quote. They both might want to look in the mirror. In Iraq, Iranian-backed militias have committed human rights abuses for years, executing and beating civilians and looting homes. These same militias have taken roles to try and influence Iraq's nascent political system. In Iraq's recent elections, the IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani himself has been spending time coercing Shiite parties with differing views to form a parliamentary majority, one that presumably would be in favor of his agenda. H.R. 4591 would sanction any foreign person, not just Iranians, but all, conducting significant destabilizing activities in Iraq. Corruption is endemic and rampant in Iraq's political system. As a representative government of the will of the people, it is key to long-term stability. This version of the bill also includes important language from Representative Poe that would require our government to look into designating 2 of Tehran's proxies in Iraq, HHN and AAH, as foreign terrorist organizations. By 2011, AAH claimed responsibility for thousands of attacks on U.S. and coalition forces. HHN, a hybrid of fighters from AAH and Hezbollah brigades of Iraq, has also played an active role against Americans during the Iraq War and now in Syria's civil war, boasting a unit in the Golan Heights targeting Israel. These groups must be called what they are, terrorists. On a different note, I want to make sure I speak in special support of Pepfar Extension Act, H.R. 6651. I want to thank co-sponsors Chris Smith and Barbara Lee. This committee continues to do bipartisan work to promote human life and dignity worldwide by seeking to address acute humanitarian needs, and to reduce global poverty. U.S. goodwill reflects our shared value that all people deserve opportunities to reach their fullest potential and to promote the common good. Pepfar is one of the most successful programs demonstrating U.S. leadership. The reauthorization ensures that 10% is set aside for some of the most vulnerable among us, orphans and vulnerable children. These programs provide psychological care and support, household economic strengthening, legal protection, education, health and nutrition, and family and community strengthening services. Strengthening the systems that support vulnerable children and families ensures that children living with the HIV virus receive the support they need, and the HIV-negative children know their status and remain negative. Thank you for ensuring that children are protected as part of Pepfar reauthorization, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership in bringing all of these bills to the committee and ultimately to the floor. I want to thank you for marking up my bill, H.R. 6651, the Pepfar Extension Act of 2018, a 5-year extension of a landmark law authored by Chairman Henry Hyde in 2003. Members who were here at the time might recall that Henry Hyde was eloquent, aggressive, and persuasive, because at that point, we knew the pandemic was exploding all over the world, particularly in Africa. And that man whose portrait sits to my right, your left, Henry Hyde, was absolutely tenacious in making sure that we acted, and we acted promptly with sufficient resources to really get the job done. I will never forget his eloquence. He compared the HIV/AIDS pandemic to the Black Death, to the bubonic plague that ravaged all of Europe. And he said, if we don't act, who will? And when we acted, Europe and many other countries began to follow suit, and very, very critical masses of money and technical expertise and health interventions began to flow. First proposed and strongly pushed by President Bush and continued through the Obama administration and into the Trump administration, Pepfar has been and continues to be an historic sweeping health and humanitarian initiative that has saved the lives of millions, and it is a triumph of bipartisanship. And let's not forget that the legislation also includes tuberculosis. In my committee, we've held hearings just recently about how TB is now the leading infectious disease in the world, and with multi-drug resistance making some people uncurable, because TB is usually very curable. It is a problem, so this money continues to be deployed in order to combat that. And of course, malaria, which ravages especially children, especially in hot tropical climates, including and especially in Africa and some parts of Asia. This legislation, again, continues to provide very, very important money to those individuals and health care. It is estimated that some 16 million lives have been saved, 16 million, due to Pepfar, and 13 countries are on track to control their HIV/AIDS epidemic by 2020. Consider that when Pepfar was launched 15 years ago, and I know my good friend and colleague, Ms. Ross Layton, pointed this out as well, only 50,000 people in Africa had access to any life-saving antiretroviral treatment, or ARVs. Now, roughly 14 million men, women, and children are receiving such ongoing treatment, because it has to be ongoing in order to be efficacious in treating the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Pepfar has also made possible the end of mother-to-child transmission of HIV/AIDS. Some 2.2 million babies have been born HIV-free to HIV-positive mothers. It used to be the mom had the disease during the child traversing through the birth canal, it was highly likely that that girl or boy would contract the disease as well. The lives of so many have been enhanced, not just those infected by HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, or malaria, but the family members and friends who have their loved ones with them now, today, are thriving because of this Henry Hyde initiative, which was backed so and pushed so strongly by President Bush, and of course, in a bipartisan way. Our group of bipartisan original sponsors have sought to extend the reauthorization of Pepfar, as I said in the beginning, for another 5 years. I want to thank my lead Democratic sponsor, Barbara Lee, for her commitment to extending Pepfar, as well as to commend the leadership shown by Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, Chairwoman Emeritus Leanna Ross-Layton, and we will miss her, and my distinguished colleague on the Africa Subcommittee, my good friend and colleague, Ranking Member Karen Bass. Upon consultation with Ms. Lee, we did decide to add an amendment which would explicitly extend programs aimed at supporting orphans and vulnerable children until 2023 as well. This amendment has the support of a number of organizations, including faith-based partners such as Catholic Relief Services and World Vision. Finally, I also want to single out the extraordinary work of our Pepfar coordinator, Ambassador Deborah Birx. Thank her for her leadership. First serving in the Obama administration and now in the Trump administration, Ambassador Birx has been a model of results-oriented, data-driven professionalism. Her compassionate commitment to those who suffer from HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria is truly inspiring and remarkable. On another bill, and I won't speak to them all, just two more, Mr. Chairman, because they're all good, I'd like to thank Mr. Donovan, Dan Donovan, a valued member of our subcommittee on Africa, for his leadership that he has shown with regards to Liberia. Congressman Donovan spearheaded a hearing which this subcommittee held on the future of democracy and governance in Liberia. He is a great friend of Liberia and of the Liberian American community. With House Resolution 1055, Mr. Donovan has again pointed a way forward for Liberia, a country which has emerged from a gruesome civil war in 2003. While it is true that the Special Court for Sierra Leone, we've had David Crane testify here many times at our subcommittee, the lead prosecutor, and they're the ones who convicted Charles Taylor, who never thought he would be held to account, and he got 50 years and is now in prison for his horrific crimes. In that quest for justice, and there is a continued work for truth and reconciliation, but it is unfinished. To solidify the progress that has been made in Liberia, it is important that the report of recommendations issued by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2008 be implemented, including its recommendation for establishing an extraordinary criminal tribunal for Liberia. This is a key item called for by Mr. Donovan's HRES 1055. Liberia is a country with long-standing historical ties with the U.S., and our friendship and common bonds with Liberia are deep and genuine. Liberia and Liberian Americans have no greater friend, I would say, than our good friend, Dan Donovan. You have been tenacious. Thank you. Finally, I just want to make a quick comment on the Stop Organ Trafficking Act and strongly support it. This act amends the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 by adding the involuntary removal and selling of organs as actionable items, as items to be included in the tip report and all things that we do vis-a-vis trafficking in persons. Nowhere is this more evident, is there more evidence of this gruesome trade than in the People's Republic of China. And I've held hearings on it on the China Commission, which I also chair. In the nearly 20-year effort to eradicate the Falun Gong, the Chinese Communist Party has illegally imprisoned and killed countless Falun Gong practitioners. Researchers David Kilgore, David Mattis, and Ethan Gutman have conducted detailed investigations and estimated that between 45,000 to 65,000 Falun Gong practitioners were killed, murdered for their organs, which were then sold for profit. Those estimates may now be even higher. The Chinese government continues to insist that accounts of torture, sexual crimes, and arbitrary detention and all of the human rights abuses for which they are known for of Falun Gong practitioners and others are mere rumors, and yet the evidence points precisely to the opposite. Mr. Chairman, this bill is an excellent next step in countering this vile trade and will bring us one step closer to ensuring that life and human dignity are respected. However, we should also be calling on the Department of State and the international medical community to do detailed analyses and studies on the trafficking of persons for the purpose of selling their organs and make every effort to ensure that countries such as China are held accountable. Again, I want to thank Congressman Trott for his leadership. This is a tremendous bill and deserves the unanimous support of every member of this committee in the House.
And we go now to Mr. Espaillat of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Engels. Thank you for continuing your bipartisan work in this committee. There are a number of important pieces of legislation before this committee today, and I would like to highlight a few I find to be particularly important. First, H.R. 1006, condemning the deterioration of the situation in Venezuela, recognizes the humanitarian crisis underway in that country, which has led to terrible food and health shortages, and therefore propelling many of Venezuelans to flee to other countries, further adding to the refugee crisis. In addition, the Maduro administration continues to crack down on the opposition and jail many of its leaders. It is important that we work with our allies to address this crisis and that we further our humanitarian assistance and multilateral sanctions. The people of Venezuela are hunger for democracy, and they are starving for food. And so this is fastly becoming a dramatic humanitarian crisis in the region, propelled and pushed by the Maduro dictatorship. We must continue to do more to aid the people of Venezuela. H.R. 1567, the United States-Mexico Partnership Act, this bill, which requires a strategy to further economic cooperation and prioritize educational and professional exchange programs between our country, highlights the crucial relationship between our countries. This is vital at a time when the relationship between our nations have strained by the administration approach to negotiating with our neighbors. Mexico continues to be a friendly neighboring country. We must treat it as such. I think this particular resolution furthers that rather than very harsh adversarial language that often puts people apart. H.R. 4591, the Preventing Iranian Destabilization of Iraq Act, will sanction any person who's meddling in Iraq and causing further deterioration of the situation there. Iran's region meddling in state-sponsored terrorism must be reined in, and we cannot allow for Iran to continue in this fashion. I strongly support these and the other bills before the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the remaining part of my time.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Ted Poe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to support Mr. Kinzinger's bill, H.R. 4591, in Preventing Destabilization of Iraq Act. Just yesterday, my subcommittee held a hearing on Iran's growing influence in Iraq. It is my opinion and the opinion of others that Iran is trying to make Iraq a puppet state of Iran. Every witness made it clear the biggest threat to Iraq's continuing stability and sovereignty today is Iran. On the ground, those who do Tehran's bidding in Iraq are the multitude of Iranian proxy militias operating in the country. They have blood on their hands of Americans, Iraqis, Syrians, and Kurds. In May, these terrorist criminals want increased power in Iraq's Council of Representatives. We must do everything we can to isolate these terrorist groups, these militias. They not only directly threaten our soldiers and diplomats, but they threaten the very future of a democratic and stable Iraq. I'm glad the committee has included the key components of my Iran Proxies Terrorist Sanction Act in Mr. Kinzinger's bill. This will target 2 Iraqi militias that act as Iran's foreign legion in Iraq and Syria. These 2 groups, known as AAH and HHN, are terrorist groups. They have killed Americans and just last month fired mortars at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and the U.S. Consulate in Basra. Yet despite the countless evil acts, they have not been designated as terrorist groups by our State Department. Instead, when my staff visited our embassy in Baghdad recently, these State Department officials scoffed at the proposal to sanction these murdering proxies, saying it would cause the groups to be aggressive against the U.S. Well, the inaction allowed AAH and HHN and their Iranian masters to gain substantially more political power, and then in spite of the State Department's appeasement and inaction, as I mentioned recently, soon after my staff visited the embassy, mortars came into the embassy from these 2 groups. There are even other more prominent Iranian-controlled groups acting in Iraq, and I hope this bill will send a message to them that we know who they are. I've also introducing an amendment that names 7 individuals in leadership roles in various Iranian-backed proxy militias in Iraq. The amendment will require the State Department to determine whether they too should be designated as terrorists. These men have sworn allegiance to the supreme leader in Iran and have killed and displaced thousands in both Iraq, and Syria. They are enemies of both the United States and the people of Iraq and the free world. I would also like to commend Mr. Wilson for his amendment to target Afghan and Pakistani mercenary brigades of the IRGC operating in Iraq and Syria. Taken together, this bill will go a long way toward correcting a history of paralysis and inaction of the United States in dealing with proxies and the attempt of Iran to make Iraq a puppet state. Also, I'm proud to have worked closely with Ranking Member Engel and Mr. Adam Smith and Mr. McCall on H.R. 5273. Too often we focus our efforts on trying to end violence without addressing the underlying issues. This bill is a bold attempt to change that. This bill will set up initiative that will improve global, regional, and local coordination of efforts to prevent violence and address the root causes of violence. Importantly, this initiative will improve the effectiveness of U.S. foreign assistance and enshrine rigorous monitoring and evaluation. The bill will reform our approach to foreign assistance by having all U.S. government agencies work together. What a novel approach that is. And I want to thank Ranking Member Engel for his leadership on this issue, as well as my colleagues, Mr. Smith and Mr. McCall. And lastly, in my comment in this remaining minute, I want to point out again, as has been said before, that this committee works on a bipartisan basis, works very well on a bipartisan basis. Other committees in the House of Representatives should take note of the bipartisanship of most of the legislation that comes out of this committee. And I really want to commend Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel on working together on these very important international issues, and our committee speaking as one voice. And lastly, my own last comment would be, I want to thank Mr. Engel, Ranking Member, personally for the time that he has worked with me. We come from almost two foreign countries, New York and Texas, and I appreciate his patience over the years in dealing with certain issues, but talking to me personally, and I want to thank Ranking Member Engel for his long time involvement in foreign affairs and his service in Congress. And I'll yield back.
Would the gentleman yield to me before he yields?
Sure, I'll yield.
Yes, I want to thank the gentleman from Texas, who has been an outstanding, a stellar member of this committee. It's because of people like him and his intellect and his attitude that really has helped make this committee the bipartisan committee that we all strive on both sides of the aisle to make. I have always said that when it comes to foreign policy, politics and partisanship should stop at the water's edge. The threats that we have to this country are threats to all of us, regardless of political persuasion. And that's what I like so much about this committee. It's people like the gentleman from Texas who have added so much to this committee and to the dialogue through the years. And I certainly will miss him, and I wish him Godspeed and only the best. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I'll yield back my time to the chair.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Michael McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I too would like to say what an honor it's been to serve with Congressman Ted Poe, my dear friend and colleague. We came into Congress together 15 years ago, and I'm going to miss you on a lot of levels, but you have served your country well, sir, and thank you so much for that. I'd also like to thank Congressman Smith for his leadership on this Pepfar extension. Since its inception, the program has provided life-saving drugs to over 14 million people. And I was recently at Texas Children's Hospital at an event with the president of Botswana, who basically described how this program and what the doctors at Texas Children did was saved his country, in his words, from extinction. It's not very often we get to pass legislation in the Congress and hear that we saved a country from extinction because of a bill that Congress passed. So, Congressman Smith, thank you for bringing this up again. It's vitally important, not only to Africa, but to the world, that we reauthorize this. And the importance of that program cannot be understated, and I applaud the consideration of it again. Turning my attention, I wanted to highlight two measures that I introduced, the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act, which I wrote with Ranking Member Engel, and the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership Act. Both of these bills coordinate a whole-of-government approach to fight global terrorism at its root causes. Too often when global crises emerge, the United States commits financial and other resources to immediately address the problem. While we must continue to tackle such imminent threats, we must do more to prevent threats from emerging in the first place. Now, this makes me think back to 2001. Prior to 9/11, Afghanistan was not a foreign policy priority of the United States. It was barely on anybody's radar. And so were the embassies in Africa, and the USS Cole, and the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. But 17 years later, we're still in Afghanistan, committing significant resources to rebuilding that country. Afghanistan was what we call a fragile state. Broadly speaking, these are countries where the government loses legitimacy in the eyes of its people and struggles to govern. What if we could identify so-called fragile states ahead of time and prevent them from failing? That is why I helped introduce the Global Fragility and Violence Reduction Act. This bill requires the administration to launch a global initiative to reduce fragility and violence, guiding our efforts to help fragile states down a path towards stability. The bill also requires the Department of State, in coordination with USAID and the Department of Defense, to identify 10 countries or regions as pilot programs to start this new initiative. Since each fragile state is different, this initiative is flexible to address the causes of fragility in each case. One area of the world where state fragility and violent extremism currently persists is in North and in West Africa. Since our operational successes against ISIS and the collapse of the caliphate, many of their fighters have splintered and fled to Africa, where other terrorist organizations have flourished. Today, it is estimated that 10,000 ISIS and al-Qaeda jihadists have already set up camps across the continent, with Boko Haram and others having spread terror for years. These terrorist organizations pose an immediate threat, and we must work with our regional governments to build their capacity to blunt these terrorists. My bill, which I introduced with my friend Mr. Keating, authorizes also from the first time the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership to aid our efforts to help fight these terrorists in Africa. This program works alongside countries like Chad and Mali and Nigeria to build their capacity to conduct counter-terrorist operations. This partnership also enhances the ability to monitor, restrain, and interdict terrorist movements and strengthen the rule of law. Furthermore, my bill requires the State Department, USAID, and Defense Department coordinate on a counterterrorism strategy for Africa and deliver that strategy to the Congress. State fragility, and by extension violent extremism, is a major foreign policy challenge for the United States. But by taking a multifaceted, multi-layered approach, as this bill does, we may be able to avert larger crises. It's interesting to note, I mentioned 10,000 jihadists in Africa, and prior to 9/11, there were just several hundred al-Qaeda operatives, several hundred, and they pulled off 9/11. And now today, while I do believe the threat has gone down with the collapse of the caliphate, the fact that there are still thousands of these jihadists in northern Africa and the Sahel gives me great concern and great pause. And so with that, I'd like to thank the ranking member and Mr. Keating and all the members of the committee for their support of this legislation. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now yield to Joe Wilson, gentleman from South Carolina.
And thank you, Acting Chairman Chris Smith. I'm grateful to Chairman Ed Royce and Ranking Member Elliott Engel for holding this markup on issues such as the very significant humanitarian crisis with the failure of socialism in Venezuela, led by Congressman Paul Cook and Albio Ciris, a bipartisan initiative. Remembering the Ukrainian famine of 1932 caused by Soviet repression, and extending the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, and many more. All of today's legislative actions are worthy of our attention and continue a positive bipartisan tradition of the committee. I especially want to thank Congressman Adam Kinzinger for introducing the Preventing Iranian Destabilization of Iraq Act of 2018 and the amendment introduced by Congressman Judge Ted Poe. This bill and amendment would require the President to impose sanctions on Iranian-backed or controlled militias that commit violence and threaten the stability of Iraq. In addition, this bill requires the Secretary of State to publish a list of armed groups and proxy forces in Iraq receiving assistance from Iran, and requires a report by the Department of State if certain specific groups meet terrorist designation parameters. The United States must not allow Iranian influence to fill the void left by the defeated ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Emboldened and practically funded by the previous administration's failed Iranian nuclear deal, the Iranian militias are posed to incite civil war and turn Iraq into a failed state, while also spreading throughout Syria toward the Israeli territory currently threatened by Hezbollah. Just as Iran has smuggled ballistic missiles to Yemen, Iran has begun to transfer ballistic missiles to these groups in Iraq, according to our extraordinary ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley. I have offered an additional amendment that adds 2 murderous militias to the list of groups identified in H.R. 4591 who are destabilizing Iraq and Syria. One group draws recruits from Shia Pakistanis living in Iran and has engaged in battle with U.S. Special Forces. The other group comprises Shia fighters from Afghanistan. Both groups are more than proxies. They are distinct brigades of the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, the IRGC Quds Force, and answer directly to Quds Force Commander Soleimani. Iran is the foremost state sponsor of terrorism, and H.R. 4591 allows the President and the Department of State to identify and sanction these groups in order to prevent Iran from inciting civil war and further spreading their malign regional influence. I urge passage of 4591, as well as the rest of today's meaningful legislation. I yield back the balance of our time as we continue tribute to Congressman Judge Ted Poe as he is concluding his final year in Congress. Godspeed.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's so many good bills here, and I just want to say thank you to everybody on all sides of the aisle that's worked to bring all these up. I think of HRES 1035, which is U.S. and Liberia related. I've been to Liberia. It's a fantastic country with a lot of challenges, so that's very important. But I do want to specifically speak on 4591, the Preventing Destabilization of Iraq Act. I'm a veteran of Iraq. And specifically, I can tell you I've operated against Iranian forces in Iraq, and about a quarter of American casualties during the Iraq War are directly traced and related to Iranian action and technology, so they are no innocent nation. You think about the destabilization they're doing in Syria and the 500,000 dead Syrians, many of which are children, thanks mainly to Bashar al-Assad, Iran, and Russia. And so it's time for us to stand up, especially in our ally, Iraq. This legislation, which I worked on with Mr. Swazi, would help prevent Iran from spreading their malign influence in the Middle East. I would also like to briefly thank Chairman Poe, as many have, for working with us to include the important provisions from his bill, the Iranian Proxies Terrorist Sanction Act, into H.R. 4591, and specifically for Chairman Poe's many years of service to his country. Following the elections in Iraq earlier this year, we saw Iranian proxies and Iraqis working on behalf of the Iranians, attempting to form a coalition government in Baghdad. As a result, Iranian-backed militias have significantly expanded in Iraq and have not only attacked U.S. forces, but have targeted innocent Iraqis as well. Just earlier this month, we saw the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad attacked, and new reports are emerging that the Iranian regime has transferred ballistic missiles to these proxies in Iraq. Not only will this kind of interference destabilize the country, but it's creating conditions for the next generation of terror. While these developments are concerning, I'm glad to see that the Iraqi population has been peacefully protesting and demanding an end to political corruption and Iranian meddling in their country. That's why passing this legislation is so timely. The Preventing Destabilization of Iraq Act would impose sanctions such as freezing assets and travel restrictions on Iranians or any other person who threatens the peace and stability of Iraq. Passage of this legislation ensures the Iranians are not given a free pass to meddle in the affairs of the Iraqi people. And I have to stress, doing nothing only strengthens the Iranians and their proxies. I think it's important to note that the light of Iranian leadership is dimming, and the light of the people of Iran is getting brighter every day. It's just a matter of time until the Iranian people are able to throw off the tyrannical regime of Iran. I encourage my colleagues to pass this measure, and I urge for quick consideration on the House floor. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kissinger, and thank you again for your service. You know, I would just note, and I think most on the committee know it, that you got the Airman's Medal for saving the life of a young woman who was savagely attacked. You have served with great distinction, and so thank you so very much.
Thank you
for your bill.
Thanks.
I'd like to now yield to Mr. Fitzpatrick, gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am proud to speak today in strong support for HRES 931, a resolution recognizing the 85th anniversary of the Ukraine famine genocide. Between 1932 and 1933, the Ukrainian famine, known as the Holodomor, led to the deaths of millions of innocent Ukrainians, men, women, and children alike. This famine was perpetrated by Joseph Stalin in an attempt to quash the nation's independence movement and fierce opposition to collectivization. This resolution serves as a meaningful tribute to honor those who met their demise at the hands of a brutal dictator and a brutal regime. It also serves as a stark reminder of the horrors of communism and oppression, and a message to the world that we must never go back and that freedom and democracy must be our guide going forward. I'm proud to stand with the Ukrainian community here at home and abroad in their continued fight against foreign aggression. The spirit of the Ukrainian people is strong and it is resilient, and it is this spirit that will overcome any adversities facing their great country. I'm thankful to my friend from Michigan, Mr. Levin, along with the other co-chairs of our Ukrainian caucus, Ms. Capter and Mr. Harris, for introducing this honorable resolution along with myself. It is a pleasure serving with them to advance the cause of Ukrainian Americans across this country and across the world. We have their back. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Go to Mr. Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for your service to this institution for so many years now. You've done a particularly tremendous job as chairman of this committee, and thank you for your service. We will not forget. You'll be long remembered here. I also, as many others have, want to thank Ted Poe for his tremendous work on this committee and in Congress in general as well. You will both be missed tremendously. As we wrap up this Congress, we have a lot of good bills before us today, and many of our members have already talked about them. I want to focus on just a couple. First, I'm co-sponsor of HRES 1006, which condemns the deteriorating situation in Venezuela due to the actions of President Maduro and his Socialist Party, and I want to thank Chairman Cook for his work on this legislation. Maduro has uprooted any semblance of democracy from Venezuela and plunged this country into its worst economic crisis ever, and many, many people are suffering tremendously as a result of that. Conditions are so bad that over 2 million Venezuelans have fled their country, creating a humanitarian crisis throughout the region. Maduro and his cronies are so corrupt and abusive that we have sanctioned 80-some individuals, and it's pretty clear that many of them have committed crimes against humanity. Venezuela, let's remember, it's right in our backyard, so we need to help make sure that this mess gets cleaned up, and sooner rather than later. Second, I urge my colleagues to support HRES 931, which recognizes the 85th anniversary of the Ukrainian famine, and I want to thank Mr. Levin for his work on this resolution. As a co-sponsor of this legislation, I think it's vitally important that as the memory of the Soviet Union fades, we must not forget the victims of communism. The Ukrainian famine was caused by socialist policies and Stalin's deliberate efforts to prevent aid from reaching affected areas. Communism is and was and always will be evil, And we must never forget that, particularly at a time when its running partner, its cousin, socialism, seems to be getting more and more popular, especially, unfortunately, on many college campuses in this country. We must never forget that there is a relationship between those two entities. This resolution is also timely since Vladimir Putin continues to undermine the sovereignty of Ukraine. Like Stalin, he never really recognized Ukraine as an independent country. The West must not let Putin succeed. The safety of the Ukrainian people and the stability of Europe as a whole requires Putin to understand that he cannot invade other countries with impunity. Finally, and I want to thank Mr. Kinzinger and Judge Poe for their leadership on the issue of Iranian proxies in Iraq. The Preventing Destabilization of Iraq Act seeks to help meet this challenge. Iran's hegemonic ambitions and nefarious activity have increasingly become one of our greatest problems in the Middle East, if not the greatest obstacle bringing stability to that troubled region. One component of Iran's strategy is to grow its influence. It's the proxy forces in Iraq. These forces not only destabilize the country, but also undermine our hard-won gains there. Tehran cannot be allowed to continue to build its influence and make Iraq a client state. And it's high time that we push back harder and harder. And I know that many people have sacrificed over there, including, as was indicated before, people like Mr. Kinzinger, who literally put their lives on the line there. So we need to work much harder, and I want to thank again the chairman for his leadership on this committee, and I yield back.
Thank you. Are any other members seeking recognition? Okay, hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on the items considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The measures are considered en bloc. They're agreed to, and without objection, each measure in the en bloc is ordered favorably reported as amended, as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. Staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes, and the chair is authorized to seek House consideration under suspension of the rules. And this concludes our business today. I thank Ranking Member Engel. I thank Mr. Schneider for filling in here as Ranking Member for the end of the hearing, and all of the committee members for their contributions and assistance with today's markup. The committee stands adjourned.